hello. Hello and welcome. Welcome to Around the Town with Mark. I am Mark Whalen, your host, and you know I always tell you, and I mean it, that we're always glad to have you tune in and visit with us. Well, today we've got another really interesting show for you. We've got another of our history series, and we're going to be focusing on that beautiful area, the mouth of the Thames River on the Groton side, known as Eastern Point. Most of you all are familiar with the beautiful Eastern Point Beach, but maybe not so much the fascinating history of the entire Eastern Point neighborhood. Well, my guest today is going to tell us all kinds of fascinating facts about Eastern Point Beach and Eastern Point in general. So allow me to introduce the Groton town historian, Jim Streeter. Jim, welcome to Around the Town with Mark, or I should say welcome back.
Nice to be here, Mark.
Well, nice to have you back, and here we are with our second of our history series.
Yes.
And very appropriate, I think. As I said, we're going to be talking about Eastern Point area, which is beloved by everybody, and certainly has been around a long time and changed a lot over the years.
It certainly has.
It certainly has. So why don't we start out just sort of a little brief overview of what the Eastern Point experience is actually today for our visitors.
Well, today there are many full-time, around-the-year homes down there. Where previously there were summer cottages, and on our last program we discussed the Grizzle Hotel, and a lot of those cottages related to the hotel and the other activities. And some of the other activities, one of the prime ones, was swimming. And of course, we are very fortunate in the city that we have what I consider a jewel of southeastern Connecticut, and that's the Eastern Point Beach.
It's a little bit of a hidden jewel still, I think, for a lot of people. And we should make mention that a lot of those cottages that you're referring to were built in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Usually, it started building up around 1890 and then continued into the early 1930s, where these cottages were built. And again, they were summer cottages, so they built them, but they weren't, we'll say, year-round homes, which they are today, because a lot of people converted them into year-round homes.
Well, I live in an 1885 one in Eastern Point, so yeah, I'm very familiar with that. And that's what we mentioned on the show previously, is that a lot of people, when they think of our area and of Eastern Point, they see it as a residential area, which it is now. But at one point when these homes were built, these houses were occupied, maybe 2 months out of the year, and the rest of the time everything was just shut down and there wasn't anybody around.
No, there wasn't. Usually around June to October were the prime periods of time where visitors came, and a lot of them came in from out of state. That's where, and to put it plainly, a lot of well-off people spent their time down there.
Oh yeah, and you know that term cottage was used very loosely, really, because even those grand homes in Newport were called cottages.
That's correct.
So, which it's.
And I just to piggyback on that, the mansion, the Morton Plant Mansion, which is in Eastern Point, the AV property, that was his summer cottage.
Yeah.
And that was a $3 million home.
Right, in $1,900, which is, figure that out
That's
today.
Right. That's correct.
Yeah,
That's correct.
So tell us how then the Eastern Point area and Eastern Point Beach went from being that summer vacation to a year-round, and of course now the beach, which is now a public beach, versus which was at one time a private estate.
For years, beginning in the 1930s, the residents of the borough back then, which is now the city, desired to have a public beach, an area where they could relax and enjoy recreational activities relating to the ocean. So in 1945, coincidentally, it's July 2nd, the day, 2 days before the 4th of July, some residents came to the city, it was a borough, the warden and borough of Burgesses back then, and requested that a study be done to acquire a beach. So the warden appointed a committee, and they looked at several areas. We were fortunate we ended up with a beach, but we had 7 different areas that were considered as a beach for the borough or the city of Groton. It goes back Let me give you some history on some of them.
Yeah, please.
They looked at Ocean Beach. They wanted to go to Ocean Beach, but they decided, transportation problems. The other portion with the transportation is young children would be driving that, and it'd be too hazardous and too long of a travel for the children to travel that far to Ocean Beach. And then, of course, we had the working people. And when they got off the work, just like today, they want to go to the beach for a few hours, relax, enjoy the water, enjoy the sun and breezes, have a picnic. Well, they figured by traveling to Ocean Beach at the time, it just wouldn't be conducive to have an enjoyable time because of time restraints. And then, of course, they have to pay for admission. They'd have to pay for the facilities and things like this. Yeah. So that one was discounted right off the bat. Then they looked at an area, and a lot of people may realize this, off of Thames Street near the filtration plant, there's a small park. Today it's a veterans memorial for the POWs, prisoners of war from Fort Griswold. That was a little beach area.
Was it real?
And,
I had no idea.
Local people would use it all the time, so they considered that. But because it was too small, it was too close to Thames Street, which was kind of dangerous.
I was going to say, I can't imagine that spot being a good spot.
Yeah, one of the most important issues was the fact, remember, the sewer facility is there. At that time, the raw sewage from the borough, before the sewer systems, was discharged about 400 feet out in the water near this park. So
wouldn't that make for a fun swim?
Yeah, so they discounted that one. Then they went to Jupiter Point. They looked at two areas on Jupiter Point.
Oh, right.
Now, at the south end of Jupiter Point, there's a private beach
that
there is. The lot owners pay to use. In order
a very small beach.
It is.
Yeah.
But in order to acquire that, they would have had to go through condemnation of the property, which would have been outrageously priced.
Oh, right.
That's number one. Number two, parking. No parking. Another area at Eastern Point is on the, we'll call it the Eastern Point beach side. But again, that was too small, and the water there was too mucky to use. So we have those, and another, I'm going to
There is a small private type beach right there.
There is, and that's for the owners.
For the owners, yep.
There was a place called Chapman's Beach, and if you go down by Pfizer, where the oil company is, where the big oil tanks are,
yep.
To the left of it, as you're facing it, going upriver, there's two vacant parking lots. Well, one of those parking lots, if you went down to the water, that was Chapman's Beach. And residents in that area would use that area for swimming at the time. But because there's a railroad track going through there, they would have had to build a bridge over the railroad tracks, number one. Number two, the beach, the sand area is very, very small. Number three, again, we had a sewer discharge in that area before we had our sewer systems installed.
Well, it's no wonder the location was selected at Eastern Point.
And then they considered Bluff Point. And that was interesting because Bluff Point, as we know, is in the town of Groton, but it's now owned by the state. But at the time, they were looking at that. But the cost to build a decent road to go out to the beach was cost prohibitive, and the cost of the property would have been excessive. It would have been close to $1 million, which at that time, we're talking 1965, was a lot of money.
Yeah, and anybody that's been to Bluff Point know that the good beach is way into the park.
And also at the same location is what they call Bushy Point, which is another beach that goes off to the east, to the west side of Bluff Point. They looked at that also. In order to get there, they would have had to build a bridge from Jupiter Point over. So that was cost prohibitive.
Oh, yeah.
So they eliminated that one. And then the next one they looked at, that we were all familiar with because it's an Eastern Point, is Shinnecossett Beach.
Yep, okay.
Well, Shinnecossett Beach was privately owned.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful beach. But again, if they went through the condemnation process, which they would have had to do to acquire that beach, it would have been cost prohibitive. So that one was eliminated. And now we get to the Tyler Beach.
That's right.
And that's what it was back in 1945. It was privately owned by the Tyler family, and it was called the Tyler Beach.
I think we have a picture of the Tyler house that originally, well, that's standing now. There we go. Everyone's familiar with looking at that structure. It still stands, and it's a beautiful example of a shingle-style home. Tell us a little bit about the history of that house. And obviously, it was for sale or rent, and somehow I think that's when the city acquired it, or the town acquired it. Is that correct?
They did, and we were fortunate that it was for sale. It was a reasonable price considering it was 4.5 acres, and it had one home on it at the time. That's this one that we just saw. That was the Groton Tyler house, originally built. Groton Tyler bought the property in the 1860, I believe around 1867, and then a Tyler house was built about 5 years later on that property.
Not the first house on that property.
No, it was not the first.
I think right there on our screen, that's another beauty.
That's the first Tyler, or the actual first Tyler house that Groton Tyler built. And if you look in that photograph, it's quite interesting because you'll see there's about 10 people standing out front. The whole Tyler family would come and spend their summer months there. If you look to the right, you will see there's a fenced-in area, and you can see at least one cow.
I do.
I looked at it closely. There's another one laying down closer to the house.
Okay, yeah, I think
and
I can see
interestingly, and I don't know why, but it appears the gentleman sitting on the left in the forefront is holding a rifle.
Oh.
And I have no idea whether
Wow.
he's shooting fish or or protecting his property. But that was the first Tyler house, and it was subsequently moved in 1906 to Tyler Avenue.
Oh, I think we have a picture also of the Tyler. There we go. That's a picture. I think you just took that recently of that original Tyler house, which now sits on Tyler Avenue. Yeah. Appropriate.
And I contacted the present owner of that, and they were quite pleased to receive that first photograph. And I just acquired that very recently. I myself did not know what it looked like until I acquired that picture, probably about 3-4 weeks ago. So they were quite pleased to obtain a copy of the photograph, as well as the information relating to the construction and the movement of that house.
And we have to remember, it's, moving a house is not an easy thing to do. And we're talking about way long time ago. So, and there's actually, I know of 2 or 3 other homes in our area that exist that have been moved from where they were originally
And I do
built.
too. And, as you say, it looks like it's difficult, but obviously the people that did this, that were involved in moving houses, it was nothing to them.
Yeah.
I've seen houses that were moved 2 miles. I've seen 4 or 5 houses on one street that were moved to another location. And you look at it and you say, they're working with horses.
Exactly.
That's what they're working
with.
But they did, and they did a good job of it. So that particular house movement was very instrumental and very a major part of the history of Eastern Point Beach.
And now I know that there were, we're talking about moving houses, several other houses that existed at Eastern Point that are no longer there.
That's correct. That's correct.
They were either, I guess most of those weren't moved but raised. Is that correct?
They were. There's one that was at the end of the beach. You and I discussed it when we were youngsters and playing at the beach or attending the beach. There was another house that was a Tyler house at the opposite end of the beach from the present Tyler house. That was purchased by the city, also subsequently purchased by the city.
I think we can. Do we have a picture of the aerial shot of the homes at Eastern Point that we can put up on our screen? There we go.
That's a close-up. The one we just discussed is not in this photograph.
Right.
But at the entrance of the Eastern Point Beach, there were several houses. If you look at the upper portion of that photograph, or the middle section, you'll see a large white house to the right. That was also a Tyler house. I don't know the name. Groton Tyler, by the way, had 10 children.
Okay.
And a lot of grandchildren, and they all came to Groton to enjoy the summer. That house subsequently, and I don't have the name, but in talking to a lot of friends that I have that remember that, there was a pilot that lived in that house with his wife and several children, and he was gone quite a bit because he was flying around the country. The darker colored house in the upper center, that was owned by a Mrs. Harry Bemis, and I'm still trying to acquire what their claim to fame was and how they got here,
Okay.
what they did. The two houses in between, they look like garages. At one time, they were small cottages.
Oh, really?
And they were on stilts.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say they sort of looked like buildings that would have been support buildings, not a cottage.
No, but when we talk about Eastern Point, we had
Yeah.
all these people that wanted to come down, and they had children and they had friends. So I'm sure they probably used those smaller cottages to have people stay or your friends stay.
Well, it's a shame. Why in the heck aren't those buildings still there?
Well, the city elected to raise them.
Yeah.
It cost quite a bit, as you're well
Yeah.
aware. I mean, in the front of the photograph, in the foreground of that picture, is the present Zaburski house, and you know quite a bit about that.
I know a little bit about the Zaburski house. Yeah, I mean, you can tell us more about the history of the Zaburski house, but there is a program, the Friends of the Zaburski house, and we've had several great events at Eastern Point Beach in the spring, festivals and what have you, trying to raise money to restore the interior of that beautiful home that the city owns. They've replaced all the windows and doors. They've had it painted. It's in really good shape. But we'd love to get that interior back to at least the first floor. That's a good shot of what the Zaburski house looks like today. It's a beautiful grand home and very spacious and lovely inside. But we'd like to do some restoration inside that. So definitely my viewers should stay tuned for the next Zaburski House Fair at Eastern Point Beach.
Absolutely, and I give the city quite a bit of credit for putting the time and the effort, as well as a lot of friends of the Zaburski House. They don't work for the city, but they contribute time and money for the restoration of that house.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning it, because I started the Friends of the Zaburski House, and I did, and with the help of Mayor Galbraith, and it really took off well. And there's a nice group of people who really are trying hard to raise those funds.
And it's again, it's part of our community. You can hold meetings there.
Oh, you can
hold
a wedding, events, a meeting, absolutely. Yes,
I've attended many meetings in that facility. I've never been upstairs. I've never been upstairs.
You haven't? Oh, I can arrange that.
All right.
I can
I'm
arrange
sure
that
you could
tour
have.
for you. Oh, I absolutely can. It's in really beautiful condition with a lot of original wallpaper and a lot of fascinating architectural features on the second and third floor. That
And there's a lot of history there, because and to go back, that was a Tyler house at one time.
Okay.
All right. And then a woman named Mrs. Phelps lived in there. All right. And then after Mrs. Phelps, there was an Al Ronick, and it was called the Ronick House before the city changed it to Steve Zaburski House. Well, Mr. Ronick was quite well known in the community also. He and his brother William co-owned the Lighthouse Inn in New London at one time. And also, on a personal note, if you come down Mitchell Street in the city of Groton and you go up North Street heading toward the bridge, there's a small group of stores there. There's a liquor store, and there's a tailor, and a Mexican restaurant. Mr. Ronick built that. All right. And he was instrumental in having North Street put in, because it used to dead end where the Washington Park was. And again, on a personal note, for about 2 or 3 years, I owned the liquor store that was up there.
Did you?
So,
Okay.
So I have a personal connection with that.
And we should make mention just real quickly that who Stephen Zaburski was. That's that name everyone might know. The Z House, as we like to call it, or the Zaburski House. But he was the Parks and Recreation guy for many, 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 many years. And through his work, a lot of the development of Eastern Point happened.
Well, if you look back at that, if you recall the picture, we looked at where the beach was all stones.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
There
we go.
That's the photograph right there. That's what the beach looked like when the city or the borough first purchased it. By the way, the house in the background, that's the other
Tyler
house
house
that we were
Yep.
discussing.
Yep.
But the beach was just crowded with boulders and rocks. And Mr. Zaburski, after he was hired, was instrumental in cleaning that up.
Cleaning that
and
up.
a lot of that, he was a very strong man. And
Yep.
a lot of those were hand carried to trucks and things like this.
Some of those houses, we should make mention, that are in the background on the right and left, those are still existing today.
They do.
Yeah.
One is owned by Dr. Zapiri, and the other one just sold
Just
recently.
sold. The one the one over by the water tower just
Yeah.
recently sold.
And the one to the left is still there. And if you look way in the background on the right, you'll see the water tower from the old Coast Guard training station where Morton Plant had
Has his estate.
His estate. But it took quite a while for them to clean that beach up to make it. The sand was underneath all these boulders, and that was one of the studies that was conducted.
Yep.
And this is an older shot also of the beach. You see the Tyler house in the front.
Yep.
Well, where the parking lot is, there was a barn, and for livery for your horses, and the livery man lived in the upstairs portion of that barn. And after the city purchased the property, that was the first house that was raised, was the barn. All right.
All right. One of my former neighbors, Mrs. Belfleur, her family, her husband's family was a Tyler, and she remembers stories of the butler in the Tyler house actually used to fish out of the second and third floor windows.
and it's very feasible.
Of the house. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
They enjoyed themselves.
Certainly.
It was a recreation area, and I'm sure maybe the butler, even by his fishing, supplied probably some of the dinners that they had.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting when I mentioned about how many Tylers, there were several Tylers. Groton having 10 children, and then the grandchildren. Yes, there was one article I read from the Day newspaper back in the 80s, where 3 of the grandchildren came and visited. There's another small Tyler house on Beach Pond Road.
Oh, is there?
And
Yeah.
these 3 women came and stayed there. Of course, their last names are no longer Tyler, but they stayed there. And they relate a story where the head Tyler rented an entire train for all of the Tylers and their help and friends to travel from Baltimore, because that's where they came from, Baltimore, to Groton. And by the way, it took me quite a while to learn how the Tylers made their wealth, and it was making wooden barrels.
Wooden barrels,
Wooden
really?
barrels.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And they initially started in Preston, Connecticut, and then they moved to Baltimore. So,
And of course, back in the day, they would travel by train, but they would only go really as far as New London. Is that correct? And
That's correct.
And then they would get off the train, and that whole entourage would then cross the river by boat or barge or something like
that's
that.
a subject for another program.
Another program.
Is the ferry system. And part of the ferry system was the Griswold Hotel had several ferries. In fact, one of them was called the Griswold. And that would bring the people over to the Griswold, and then they would either walk or have transportation, horse and buggies to take them down to their cottages at the Eastern Point Beach area. So that was interesting.
Very. Yeah, well, it's like we mentioned in the introduction and obvious that the Eastern Point area, as so many other areas in Groton, are so rich with all kinds of history. And if we want to even go back further, I know back in the Revolution, British troops actually landed at Eastern Point Beach on their march up to Fort Griswold.
They did, and if you stop and think, as a historian, you're looking at, this was undeveloped land back in that period of time.
Yes.
And what the British had to cross over to get to Fort Griswold. The briars and the forests, and we had the swamps, but they did make it to Fort Griswold, and that's where they landed, was at Eastern Point.
So just another example, like we just said, of how fascinating the history is. And you go to the beach in the summertime, and and you're sitting out under your umbrella and, you know, going to get a hot dog, and, you know, you don't really realize that it didn't always look like that.
No, it didn't. And that's the fortunate thing of being a historian and being like yourself, being extremely interested in history. You learn all of these things, which helps you to really appreciate what you have now, what we have gone through as far as expense and development to make the beach what it is today. When you and I went to the beach, that's what it was. It was a beach. Yes, they had a couple of swings down there, but now you have a children's area with a lot of small equipment for children to enjoy. There's basketball courts. The Zaburski house, we have meetings there. There's picnic facilities. So all of this planning and development has created what I started out saying is one of the jewels of Groton. And that's that Eastern Point Beach area.
Yeah, and you know, at one point, even though, you know, you would have been, Tyler would have been happy to have it as their own, it is now everybody's. It is.
It is for everybody to enjoy, and it's very reasonable. It is a public beach. It's open to the public. Yep. Fortunately, the city residents, because they pay their extra mill rate taxes, enjoy a free pass to the beach, we'll call it. They have to pay for parking. Right. They have a parking permit they have to acquire every year. But for a minimal fee, what we call people that don't live in the city. And interestingly, while doing this research, I found what they charged when they first started the beach, and it was 25 cents for a stranger.
Really?
Which would be an out of town. You know? So, wow. But today's world, it's just thoroughly enjoyed by a lot of people, not only that live in the city, but pay the extra to come and enjoy the benefits that we provide in the city for that beach.
Well, as we're closing up, is there anything else that we should share with our audience that we haven't mentioned that's important? I know one thing is that coming up on March 22nd, I want to tell all my viewers, mark your calendars, March 22nd at 5 p.m. at the Groton Public Library. Jim Streeter, the Groton Town historian, has given his collection to the Groton Public Library. And I guess that dedication is going to happen at 5 p.m. on March 22nd. It's a really great deal. It's a very big congratulations on that, Jim. Thank you for sharing that your vast collection with all of us. It's going to be wonderful. So I encourage everyone to go down to the public library on the 22nd. And I want to thank you again for being my guest today.
You're welcome. For
continuing our history series. It's great, and we'll have you back again very soon with a whole nother fascinating topic. Thank my viewers for tuning in again on Around the Town with Mark. As I just said, tune in often. Watch us on YouTube. We'll have another show coming up, great show coming up soon. Another history series coming up very soon. So tune in often, and thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you again soon.